And as I told that she is stood with Chandrasekhara all along, and whatever growth they have achieved today, Renuka has significant contribution made.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, one and all here. Just now, as sir has said, the last decade has been very exciting for the development of autoimmune disorders or rheumatological disorders. A better understanding of the immunologic mechanisms has further improvised in the therapeutic aspects. However, also there have been quite a few developments which have been there in the diagnostic field, particularly related to autoimmune disorders or rheumatological disorders. When you say rheumatological disorders, these are basically a group of multisystem disorders characterized by inflammation and the presence of autoantibodies. The most common of which are, of course, we are all aware, like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, Sjogren's, scleroderma, and so on. Autoantibodies are the ones which form the cornerstone of the diagnosis of autoimmune disorders, and now they have an even better role not only in diagnosis, in monitoring, and so on. We just see that. The first autoantibody which was detected was in 1948 by Hargreaves when he noted the Ellie cell phenomenon in a case of lupus, and that's what put the whole thought process going ahead. And slowly it was realized that the autoantibodies have a very big role in the autoimmune disorders or the systemic rheumatic disorders. So in 1960s and 70s, investigators worldwide started getting involved in a lot of work on autoantibodies. Various trials were going on, people were using animal tissues, but however there was not much of a standardization as for what should be the optimal cutoff value, what should be the way it should be reported, and what are the different methods which have to be adopted when we are reporting. Standardization was required, for which the Arthritis Foundation as well as the CDC reference lab then pitched in there, and in 1980 a standardized serum lyophilized was being distributed. In 1982 then the International League for Rheumatology, it recognized 5 standardized sera which were distributed to the various labs all across the globe for further studies. So you can see that it was not just about 50 or 60 years back that the first autoantibodies started coming up. And then on, there has been quite a lot of growth, not just in the terms of the antibodies which are being there, but also in the technique being developed for the diagnosis of these autoantibodies. Earlier, much complement fixation, heme agglutination, radioimmunoassays, and so on, and enzyme immunoassays. Of these techniques, the ones which still have a lot of significance when it comes to diagnosing is the indirect immunofluorescence assays and the enzyme immunoassays are the ones which are being more commonly used in a clinical or a diagnostic setting. The indirect immunofluorescence, most commonly, if you see, whenever you think of an autoimmune disorder, the first screening test which you would like to do would be an anti-nuclear antibody test, after establishing, of course, that it is of an inflammatory arthritis which is present either by doing a CRP or ESR. This was the first line of test, and it is a hallmark of SLE, but it can be present in many other conditions. Why indirect immunofluorescence is still considered a gold standard for ANA is basically because it gives various patterns which help us in understanding as to what could be the target antigen or the organelle which is involved in the autoantibodies. So the diseases where ANA is useful are usually the lupus, systemic sclerosis, myositis, Sjogren's, and it has also been found that it is positive not just in these disorders but also in other connective tissue disorders, though they are not really diagnostic criteria for these conditions like ITP or thyroid. They can be present, and as well as in the normal population up to 3% of the population ANA can be present. So that was just an example of an immunofluorescence method for doing a diagnosis. When you say in immunofluorescence, these could be because the cells are being layered onto the glass slides, and these, like in a Hep2 cell or a Hep2010 cells when it comes to an ANI, or it could also be that now biochips are being used for these immunofluorescence assays. For instance, here is the ANCA, which is having a formalin fixed, ethanol fixed biochip. This is the formalin fixed, this is the ANA and the Hep2 cell line, and this is the liver tissue. Here basically the tissues are cut, frozen sections have been cut, which are layered on to the slide, to which you directly then afterwards add the, they are bound to the cells, and then you add the antibody, treat it with an immunofluorescent conjugate, and you view it under the microscopy. So here it was not, first you had only single cell lines which were being maintained. Earlier there were different cell lines maintained, or then there were Hep2 cells, then Hep2010, and now when it comes to a biochip, here they are using tissue sections which are having this antigen of interest to which the serum sample has been added. So based on the ANCA, depending on the pattern, we report them as a C ANCA pattern or a P ANCA pattern. The C ANCA pattern is the one wherein you see these are, ANCA is anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody, which are useful in the diagnosis of vasculitis. These antibodies, if the staining is present in the cytoplasm, as you see here, then it indicates that it is a cytoplasmic ANCA pattern or a C ANCA pattern. And if it is around the nucleus over here, like in a perinuclear pattern, then it is basically, it is a P ANCA pattern. And then further, we need to do a workup to say whether it is a positivity for either PR3 antigen or a myeloperoxidase or a GBM. These are just the initial things that I'm telling, which I'm sure all of us are now aware, and all of us are using it in routine practice. So these are the things which have been there, but here this is actually a P ANCA pattern. This in alcohol fixed will show it as a P ANCA, in a formalin fixed it shows as a C ANCA pattern, and this helps us in differentiating whether it is an MPO or a non-MPO type. When a ANCA is seen in the formalin fixed, we call it as an MPO type. When it is not seen in the formalin fixed tissue, we call it as a non-MPO type of a P ANCA. So this further helps us in coming to identification of what could be the antigen which is present over there. So the C ANCA is a one very commonly positive in vaginous granulomatosis or in a microscopic polyangiitis, whereas a P ANCA is positive not just in vasculitis but also in various other conditions, as you're seeing here, like in inflammatory bowel disease or any other autoimmune rheumatic disease. Sometimes it could be present because of the presence of other antigens like cathepsin, lactoferrin, and so on. This is another biochip, like for instance here when you're thinking in terms of chronic inflammatory bowel disease, wherein you could have a tissue which has been cut from intestinal goblet cells from the mice, and this is again the ethanol fixed granulocytes. This is exocrine pancreas to see for the presence of autoantibodies against pancreas, and this is the Saccharomyces cerevisiae, wherein we see ASCA antibodies. This is the ASCA antibodies are positive, as well as the antibodies against exocrine pancreas in a case of Crohn's disease, whereas goblet cell antibodies and P ANCA pattern is very commonly seen in ulcerative colitis. So this is just an example of how you can have a cell line which is maintained, a cell culture, or it could be a biochip which is being used. Why do we need this is, as I said, once a pattern has been done, whether it is diffuse, peripheral, you have various antigens which have been identified which have a specific disease association. So now when you have so many antigens which are present, and it is once you know that an ANA is positive, you need to go further and find out what is the specific antigen which is present, or the specific antibody which is present, which could be related to a particular disease. So that is why we now need to know what is the exact antibody, because this will help in diagnosis. For this, is it required? Earlier what we were doing is we were doing an ELISA technique, so wherein if you feel that there is a possibility that I am having a diffuse pattern then probably it is a deoxy-RNP or a histone, then it could be because of a lupus, then the antibodies which I would do would be a dsDNA antibody or an SM antibody and see for the presence of a lupus. So, but now, or it could be if there is a presence of a say SSA and SSB, that is the anti-Rho, anti-La antibodies, start thinking in terms of a Sjogren's, and this I would do probably. Once there is a speckle pattern, all these antibodies had to be done. Each one had to be done individually. And very few of them are such that wherein the antibody titer is important. It is just important that whether it is positive or not. So that is why newer techniques were developed so that where we could assay multiple antibodies at the same times, and not only that, it should use a reduced volume of sample, reduce the cost, reduce the turnaround time, and also we could do different markers at one go. So that is why multiplex assays have been come up, like the line immunoassays, particularly in the last decade. We have been using it quite a lot, and then the microarrays now are the ones which have become the new interest. Probably these would be coming very soon for the utilization of detection of autoantibodies, though other things are also going on like mass spectrophotometry or surface enhanced laser desorption ionization time, wherein they actually do a combination of a mass spectrometry as well as a chromatography. So these trials are going on. Most common which we use now in this in all our labs is basically a immunoblot technique which we are doing, wherein you can assess that you are seeing multiple antibodies at the same time. These are actually membrane strips which are coated with parallel lines of purified antigens, and then if the sample is positive, the specific antibody will go and attach itself to that particular antigen, and in the second phase, after it has been reaction has occurred, you add the enzyme or the chromosome substrate solution, and later on you see for the dark band, which could either be read with a software or it could just be read with the visual reading can be done. For instance, over here, this is a strip wherein if you see there's a control band positive, SSA is positive, SSB positive, probably this could be a case of a Sjogren's, or here wherein it is a case of lupus. For in the lupus, you have so many autoantibodies which are present. Here you are seeing a nucleosome, dsDNA, SSB, SM, RNP-SM, SSB. So many of them are positive. So this probably is a case of a lupus. The very common, of course, the specific ones like dsDNA, nucleosomes are the ones which are specific for lupus. So the advantage of this is the immunoblot is that you can see multiple antibodies at the same time, and it doesn't require much expensive equipments. Similarly, this is a myositis profile which helps you to identify the various autoantibodies which are present in a case of myositis like a Me2, Cu, Jo1, PL12-7. For instance, in Jo1 is usually associated with interstitial lung disease. The PMSCL is usually seen in the overlaps of polymyositis and dermatomyositis and overlap syndromes. The anti-Me2 is highly specific for dermatomyositis, and so this will help us in understanding when you have all the antibodies being studied at the same time. So once a pattern of an ANA is positive, we go in for further differentiation of each one. This is a simple flow chart that if a test is positive, you look for the clinical features like say skin involvement, whether there is a joint involvement. After that, based on the antibodies which are present, you could come to a conclusion of a fairly fair diagnosis, though of course, as I said, clinical features become the most important thing initially for you to ask for this. Instead, here if you see, if ANA is positive, dsDNA, SM, Rho have been positive in your blot, you will be very sure it's a lupus. If there is a history of drugs and histone is positive, probably it is drug-induced lupus. Patient has dry eyes, dry mouth, even if you are not done a Schirmer's test, I mean, of course, then you might start thinking in terms of a Sjogren's syndrome. This is where the limited form of the systemic sclerosis and the diffuse form, depending on the antibody which is present, like in anticentromere is more commonly seen in the limited form like CREST syndrome, and the SCL70 is seen in scleroderma. UNRNPs are seen in mixed connective tissue disorders, though they can also be present in SLE and other conditions. So, but this still gives you a fair idea, and you are able to come to some conclusion of the antibodies. So then the thought came that why not have more and more antibodies being seen, and we get to know, because we also know now that autoantibodies are not just useful in diagnosis, they are probably involved in the pathogenic mechanisms. So in 1980s, one of the first microarrays came But for the, as far as the autoantibodies are concerned, the first microarray assay which had come was in 2000, which was developed by Juice et al., which developed the antigen arrays for the specific purpose of analyzing these autoantibodies. So these were the antibodies which they had tried, like they had done the dsDNA SM, SMB histone, UNRNP for a case of a lupus, for mixed connective tissues, UNRNP, SSA for Sjogren's, and the same list, of course, but here they've also added beta-2 glycoproteins for antiphospholipid, thyroid peroxidase for autoimmune, and it is just the beginning. Here it is just the beginning where we are seeing that there are only 18 antigens which have been involved, and this is basically in a microarray. What happens is there is something like a biochip which you have only some tissues which are kept. Here these are antigens which are put onto this kind of a, the surface, they have been immobilized, and to which, pardon? Sorry. To which the protein extracts or the serum sample has been added, the sample is incubated, and then this is image acquisition is usually done with a fluorescent scanner, and you can analyze which exact spot is present, and you will also get a software which is attached to that, which will give you what specific antigen or antibody is present. And you will have a multiple array of autoantibodies which are present, which will help us. And these, it has been found that these have been validated with various techniques like the blot assays, with the ELISA assays, and a lot of literature search has been done, and we are also detecting few more further antibodies which are being helpful in detection of these. So these are the various developments. Initially, though it has just started a decade back, 2000 was the first autoantibody, and now you have so many microarrays which are coming up for various number of antigens. Initially started with 18, then you have some of them developing 196 antigens, and now if you look at it, there are about 300 to 400 citations just on the microarrays in autoantibodies for this technique. Probably very soon we may all go in for this in the next few years, because these are now coming into clinical practice. Mass spectrometry, SLEDAI, all of those, they're still more into clinical research, and validation is still going on with those. You've seen that autoantibodies serve as markers to define and classify disease. They help us as, like for instance, the autoantibodies that you've seen, they are also useful for the activity and severity. For instance, a dsDNA really helps you in knowing what is the activity in a case of a lupus, and they also help in predicting the disorder. Let us just look at a few of these. It's got stuck. To take most commonly the SLE, about 120 autoantibodies are present, of which it has been seen that there are some antibodies which appear much before the disease presents or much before the clinical presentation is noted, like in SM antibody, centromyopathy antibodies, cardiolipins, Rho, ribonuclein P protein antibodies. These are the antibodies, of course, I'll be going a little more into detail of this, are the ones which have a predictive value. Then the pathogenic, as I said, dsDNA nucleosomes are usually associated with aggressive disease. They are useful in monitoring, particularly involvement of the kidneys, and this is the one wherein the activity is noted as dsDNA nucleosomes, and the SSA are usually seen with sometimes just the neonatal lupus may be positive without the other antibodies being present. The SSA and LA could be positive with Rho antibodies. So, and it is also being felt that probably the RNP70 and centromyopathy could probably have a protective role, but still that's not very clear. But the most commonly disease-specific antibodies which we are seeing now is SMD3, C22 ribonucleotide protein, dsDNA, and topoisomerase. Coming to this, this is the fluorescence pattern of the ribonucleoprotein. See, the thing is, when you are doing an anti-nuclear antibody by fluorescence method, you are not just looking at the nuclear antigens, but we are also looking at the cytoplasmic antigens which are present. The whole cell is there staring at you under the microscope. So when you see the ribonosyl P protein, here you see that this is what you will find in a nucleolar kind of a staining over here, along with the cytoplasmic granularity, which is a dense cytoplasmic granularity, is a pattern which you usually see in a ribonuclear P protein. Why the interest in ribonuclein is because there are quite a few studies which say now that this is a very, very specific marker for SLE, though the sensitivity is not very high. And they are sometimes present even in those cases where dsDNA or SM is not present. So this might help you in further picking up the lupus cases earlier. and some studies have shown that they relate well with the disease activity. The predictive, so basically they are predictive, they are highly disease specific and independent variable for diagnosis of lupus. So in the current AAC consensus recommendation, though this has not yet come up, it has a recommendation which I just looked up the net, which said that it should be probably added to the, as of now we have only 4 of the 11 criteria which are present for diagnosing as per the ARA criteria, of which particularly the ANA, dsDNA and the SM. These are the antibodies which are present from a diagnostic purpose, which are seen in the criteria for diagnosis, and they are recommending probably in the future this ribonuclein anti-ribonuclein peptide could be involved into the diagnosis of lupus. So there are other connective tissue disorders, sorry, I think this. Coming to the very common problem, and which we had such a wonderful presentation by Dr. U.R.K. Rao on the developments of rheumatoid arthritis. So the diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis is currently based on the ACR criteria, which was proposed recently in 2010. And the new criteria which emerge are saying that we should be able to pick up the condition much early in the course of the disease, so that you can target the therapy immediately. You can give targeted therapy immediately. And for this, newer markers are there, like the anti-CCP, which are being developed. If you look into the 2010 ACR classification criteria, wherein it gives a scoring system for the score of the joints, and it says that at least the score should be more than 6 for a definitive RA. But if at all, if the score is less than 6 and you have some of these antibodies which are present, then we should definitely follow up the early arthritis or the undifferentiated arthritis. We should be following up these cases for presence of, for the development of a rheumatoid arthritis, because then you can probably give the treatment earlier. So the serological markers, I'll just focus on that, are basically, other than the inflammatory markers, we are the rheumatoid factor and the anti-citrullinated peptide antibodies, or the anti-cyclic citrullinated peptides, which is the antibodies which are most commonly being used. Sorry. Rheumatoid factor, of course, is the most common and still the test which is being used for the diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. And it is present in 75 to 85% of cases with rheumatoid arthritis, and but it might be absent in the early in the course of the disease. And the other thing is that it does give us a lot of false positive reactions. It could be positive in many other conditions like a lupus, scleroderma, or any other lymphomas or neoplasms, hepatic disorders. It could be positive, and that is the only concern. So it should be done in a proper clinical context. But definitely they do have a role, because a high rheumatoid factor correlates with higher erosive arthritis, and these are the ones which should be done as a test. It should be done for the diagnosis as the first line of investigation. But in addition to that, there are a lot of other antibodies which are present, like the new were developed over a period, because as I said, it has false positives. It is not very commonly present early in the case of the disease. So that being the thing, there are a lot of other antibodies which have come up, like perinuclear keratin antibodies which detect profiligrin, antifiligrin, anti-SA, and now of course in 1998 what was developed was the anti-CCP antibodies. See, the problem with all the profiligrin and all that was the technical inabilities and the sensitivity and the specificities of this. The anti-CCP and the perinuclear factor and have a similar sensitivity but low specificity, whereas the anti-SA, though being specific, it was much lesser than anti-CCP. And of all these antibodies which have been developed, probably anti-CCP has been the best that has been as far as the increase in the early pickup of the case of this disease. So these are basically citrullinated cyclic peptides, are arginine residues which are converted to citrulline, and they are usually seen at the site of inflammation. These have been found, the citrullinated peptides have been found in other tissues also, but antibodies to these have been found mainly into the rheumatoid arthritis. So this is just a simple potential mechanism. I have just put in a graphical representation that the epitopes of the antigen are arginines which are converted to citrulline, which arise at the site of local inflammation. which are processed by the antigen presenting cells, which then share a MHC epitope and present it to the T cells. This has been very nicely explained by Dr. URK now, how does the activation of T cells occurs. And then the T cells, activated T cells further lead to clonal expansion of the T cells and cell mediated immunity, as well as it leads to the activation of the B cells and causing the production of anti-CCP antibodies. When it comes to anti-CCP antibodies, in a meta-analysis it has been realized that they have a sensitivity which is on par with rheumatoid factor but much higher specificity. The specificity of anti-CCP antibody is very high. These are present much before the disease symptoms developed, and that's why they are very useful in the early diagnosis of arthritis. This is a picture to show, I think, that they are present much before the clinical. I think this is a different one. That this is the first clinical symptoms, and you will find them much earlier, the presence of anti-CCP antibodies. These are associated, follow-up studies have shown that these have been associated with erosive arthritis, and they have great prognostic implication, and they are helpful in early diagnosis, and the presence of anti-CCP indicates that probably they have a persistent and erosive arthritis. It was also noted in a few studies that there is a fall in the anti-CCP after the therapy. So it has been noted now, what we find is that anti-CCP is a specific marker. Anti-CCP2, and here also again first anti-CCP1 was developed. There was no cyclic form of it, a linear form was there initially, then anti-CCP2 was formed, which uses synthetic recombinant antigens for the coating of the ELISA wells. So here it has been, now it is known that anti-CCP2 has a higher sensitivity than anti-CCP1 for the diagnosis of rheumatoid arthritis. They present early and they decrease with remission and increase with disease, and it's also useful as a prognostic marker, to just summarize that. We had also done one study of role of anti-CCP in the early arthritis, wherein we had taken 143 cases who were rheumatoid factor negative, on which an anti-CCP assay was done, and our specificity that we found was similar to that of the one with rheumatoid, the rest of the world or the literature. So it's a very useful in early diagnosis as well as a prognostic marker. The other thing is the very lot of changes have been occurring is the antiphospholipid antibody syndromes. Here it has been noted, basically antiphospholipid syndrome is a thrombotic condition wherein you have a co-occurrence of the clinical of thrombotic events or recurrent pregnancy loss is what is noted. These are responsible about 15 to 20% of deep vein thrombosis in patients less than 50 years of age. The earlier Sapporo classification, which was done in 1999 in Japan, and then later on there have been changes which have been brought about to this. The main changes are that initially there was no beta-2 glycoprotein which was there into the classification of diagnosis of lupus, antiphospholipid antibody syndrome, and the values of the anticardiolipin cutoff, they have now established optimal values for the cutoff of the anticardiolipin antibodies for it to be clinically significant. So these are the revised classification criteria, wherein you should have at least one clinical criteria and one lab criteria. The clinical criteria are vascular thrombosis, could be an arterial venous or a small vessel, or it could be a pregnancy morbidity where you could have recurrent abortions, or there are quite a few criteria over here. And as far as the lab criteria are concerned, the main three the things which we see here are lupus anticoagulant, anticardiolipin antibodies, and the anti-beta-2 glycoproteins. The lupus anticoagulant was the first antiphospholipid antibody which was detected. It is basically a misnomer, basically because it is not just present in lupus erythematosus alone. It is, and the other thing is, it is not an anticoagulant. And if you look into it, it is having a thrombophilic condition. In vivo, it acts for thrombosis, whereas when you see ex vivo, it is more like it acts, when you do the coagulation assay, it works like an anticoagulant. That is why it has been called as a lupus anticoagulant. The two tests which have been recommended currently now are DRVVT test and APTT. These are done as an initial assay. First we do a DRVVT, then we do a dilute Russell Viper venom test. We do a mixing study of these If the lupus anticoagulant value is high, then we normal control sample, and then to see whether it is improvising or not, and then further we also give excess of phospholipids and see for the correction if it occurs of the increase in the lupus anticoagulant. And this is the one which is very useful in the diagnosis of the antiphospholipid antibody. It predicts about a 50% chance of thrombotic events in a 20-year follow-up. However, when we are doing this test, the patient should be not on anticoagulants like heparin or oral anticoagulants like warfarin. The anticardiolipin antibodies, here again ELISA is the one which is lupus anticoagulant, usually done on a coagulation method, whereas anticardiolipins, lupus anticoagulant is not a single antibody again. There you look in for protein C, protein S, prothrombins, and all those antibodies are seen in lupus anticoagulant. Similarly, when you look at anticardiolipin, it is not a single antibody, but these are the antibodies which are bound to the cardiolipin which are seen, and like the anionic phospholipases which are there, like prothrombin. And these anticardiolipin antibodies, usually we do an IgG as well as an IgM assay. The low positive results were less important than high positive results. That is why now the new criteria they are suggesting probably 40 should be a cutoff, but still it is still we do report still up to 12 or 20 as of now, but the new updated criteria says that you should take 40 GPL units. But there's still a controversy on that, because they say that though it is having a low values, it still does have a significant importance, though may not be as high as the higher values. And when you do the anticardiolipins, here you say, I get query, you have IgG and IgM. So like in infection, it is thought like IgM is a recent infection and IgG is a old infection. So when it comes to anticardiolipins, it is different. Here anticardiolipins, the IgG class have a more thrombotic tendency or more history of thrombosis and more significant than the IgM antibodies. And there is a thought process now that probably IgM antibodies should be done or not, but still as of now it has not been changed. The thing which has been added up into the new classification is the beta-2 glycoprotein 1 antibody currently, and this has been discovered in 1990. It is very important in the pathophysiology also, associated with all the clinical complications, and supposed to be much more specific than either an anticardiolipin antibody. Though there are tests wherein you say that you are doing anticardiolipin antibodies which are having along with it an associated beta glycoprotein, but it is now important that you should be done independently a beta-2 glycoprotein, it has to be done. And these have been further, there is a group which says that you should classify them as whether all the antibodies are present, whether it is only anticardiolipin, lupus anticoagulant and beta-2, each one present, wherein you classify as 2A, 2B, 2C individually, or a group of them which you call as triple positivity, because as the positivity increases, the number of the chances of having a thrombotic tendency increases. So if you see now, there are a lot of new techniques which are developing, various antibodies which are coming. This was just a simple, humble effort that I tried to put forward, that what are the various antibodies which are coming up, and we might have so much more further in future. We will be able to detect not only disease early, probably over a period, the way now you have lipid profiles, you do it because they are having a tendency for developing for MIN. You might come up with some autoantibodies in the future. If you do these antibodies as a screening assay, maybe you will be able to predict whether the patient will have disease or not. But still, I think for that we have a long way to go. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Renuka, for the excellent presentation. One simple question.
Yes, sir.
Will the cost of these tests like antiphospholipid antibodies, ANCA, anti-CCP, will it ever come down?
Sir, it will come down, sir.
Oh, thank you.
Definitely it will come down, because anything when it starts initially, the kits available are very, very expensive. We have seen the changes happening in anti-CCP, wherein the costings have slowly started coming down, which was very high earlier. I remember we used to charge 2,000, then 1,500, then it came to 1,200, and probably we are, but now again the only concern is because these are all imported products which we get. Now again the euro prices have gone high, so the people are saying we can't bring down the costing. So probably that happens. We can also give it to the patients at a much lesser cost, and as you said, like rheumatoid factor, anti-CC might be done as a first line thing, immediately. Maybe some, not very, very soon, I hope.
Thank you.
Not very far.
Is there
EC.
row 52, is there any significance apart
So,
from SSC,
we have
SSD?
seen that Rho 52 is present very commonly in lot of, even sometimes with no antibodies being present, Rho 52 has been positive actually. So we haven't really found any clinical significance to that, but probably there was a, when we had a urine meet, that time they were telling probably it could just be one of the initial markers that there's some autoimmune disorder, you need to work it up further kind of a thing.
So if the row 52 alone is there, we may not give much
We
importance.
will not give importance to it.
It was a very humble presentation.
Sorry, sir.
I,
Because there is really an explosion occurring, sir. When you look into the search now, I mean,
I thought it was a very comprehensive, well-made presentation. I have one question.
Yes, thank you.
If you consider CCP
Yes.
as an inflammatory biomarker, why is it positive only in rheumatoid arthritis?
So it is not an inflammatory parameter. It is present at the site of inflammation in a case of rheumatoid arthritis.
Why not in others?
It has not, autoantibodies to that have not been found. See, though the peptide is noted in lot of other tissues, the antibodies to that have not been developed.
That is what my question is.
Yes, yes, sir.
Then if you find that,
Yeah.
then it becomes not specific.
It becomes non-specific, definitely. But sometimes it has been found in psoriatic arthritis and things like that. Tuberculosis also, yes.
My comment is regarding interpretation of ANA by indirect immunofluorescence.
Yes.
You see it very often, especially it's misinterpreted by physicians, especially when you see positivity at low titers like 1:40 dilution. As much as 25 to 30% are false positive in such cases. I would request you to highlight the importance of dilution, the initial dilution, and how to interpret it, the dilutions.
See, when it comes to the question of dilution, these dilutions have been developed and each company has standardized this based on the CDC reference serum, and which has been validated on each kit as well as on the reference values of the population which is present around it. So when we discuss the same scenario with a few companies, because some of them are doing in 1 in 100, some do it in 1 in 60 and 1 in 40. So basically most of the kits which have been developed, they work with the values which are found and the significant values in the population in which they are, those kits are developed, the countries where they are there. The concern over here, or the major problem which we have here, is that in India there are, I think, only 1 or 2 studies have come up from SGPJ and some of the other centers, wherein they have said the cutoff value should be around 40 or 60. Some of them have, I think in one study in at SGPJ I have seen the paper which says that the cutoff value should be around 60. So, but here the thing, when you are saying that there is a question of false positivity, ANA is not being used as a diagnostic assay. It is being used as a screening assay for the presence of autoantibody. See, though the value, the intensity may be very high in a case like a lupus, but in other connective tissue disorders, it may not be that high that the autoantibody level would be. So there it would become probably important, and that is why a clinical interpretation is must. See, that is why we say these tests are not such that you say, I see an MTB on a slide and I am very sure the patient has COX. But that is not the way it goes here. This has to be interpreted in context with the clinical situation and based on the other clinical guidelines. That is why they are only one of the criteria of the diagnostic criteria. That's one thing. And second thing is when it comes to the values, see, we always put it even in our reports that a 1+ intensity has a lesser significance than that of a 3+ or a 4+ intensity. So that is why, as you know, when the intensity is only 1+ and the clinical features are not much significant, at that time you can ignore it. But suppose if you feel that patient has all the clinical features and a 1+, you might like to follow it up. That's what is important there. Because when you're doing it as a screening study, you need to follow up that case.
With more than 300 people, and we've done more than 2,000 tests. And we feel that, going with the international standards at 1:40 dilution, there's almost 20 to 30% false positivity is there. And we are recommending, though it's yet to be published, we are recommending 1:80 has to be the screening dilution for the test. And it's misinterpreted by the physicians, especially when they see 1:40 positivity and they label these people with some autoimmune disorder. So that is what was my point.
As of today, the international consensus guidelines which had come up in 2002, they had suggested for a screening assay as an ANA, 1:40 was the dilution which that was suggested.
That's what
so
most
maybe
of the
something more comes up, or probably, as you said, some better details, we might be able to do it at a further dilutions.
Thank you.
Thank you.